All right, so that was a little part from In a Silent Way, and it's hard to know where this album falls in Davis's overall discography because, there's so many different, studio albums, but then there's compilations and all this. But I can tell you that of his discography on Wikipedia, this is number 44. So, this album is
Okay.
about 10 years after. It's actually about 9 years after the album that we covered before, which was Sketches of Spain.
Okay.
And it is quite different. So this album includes Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on soprano saxophone, John McLaughlin on guitar, Chick Corea on electric piano, Herbie Hancock on electric piano as well,
Nice.
Joe Zawinul on electric piano and organ, Dave Holland on bass, and Tony Williams on drums. So you might notice there's several keyboard, piano, organ, electric piano players, and that is very noticeable throughout this entire album. It was produced by some dude named Teo Marcero, and it marks the beginning of Davis's famous electric period and is considered his first fusion album, which is essentially the combination of jazz and improvisation with funk, rock, and rhythm and blues. So this comes as an interesting time. Jazz fusion, really starts around 1967. John Coltrane dies in 67, and rock was the most popular genre at the time. And then jazz magazine Downbeat went so far as to publish a story after Coltrane died saying that the jazz as we know it is dead. So the person that's considered as the godfather of fusion is a guitarist named Larry Coryell, who I had never heard of before. In 1966, he started a band called the Free Spirits, which recorded their first album in 1967, a record called Out of Sight and Sound. And shortly after that, several other artists adopted fusion elements, and there were a number of different types of crossovers, not just musically, but things like jazz label Verve Records producing the Mothers of Invention debut album Freak Out, which we discussed in an earlier episode. All music states that online states that, quote, until around 1967, the worlds of jazz and rock were completely separate. This was kind of a new type of genre coming out. It was met with some controversy amongst critics because neither jazz nor rock critics particularly cared for it. It did do pretty well overall. As for a jazz record, it did reach number 134 on the Billboard charts, and over time, the criticisms have obviously changed, and it's now considered one of Davis's greatest and most influential works. So how this came about: Miles Davis, in September of 1968, married a then 23-year-old model named Betty Mabry. At the time, Davis was 42, which makes Mabry 19 years his junior.
I don't like
Awesome.
Inappropriate age difference.
Inappropriate age difference, but
At least they were legal compared to many, many of the other relationships we can talk about.
that is
That's
a good
true.
point, John. That is a good point. Miles Davis would describe Mabry as a high-class groupie, as she was a familiar face in the New York City counterculture, and she introduced Miles Davis to popular rock, soul, and funk musicians. And he became fascinated with a variety of genres and started listening to artists such as the Byrds, Aretha Franklin, Dionne Warwick, James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, and Jimi Hendrix. But there's a little bit of, Jimi Hendrix a lot is associated with Miles Davis during this period, but there was a little rift in the relationship because Davis's marriage to Mabry did not last too long, because in 1969 he filed for divorce after accusing her of having an affair with the guitar legend. So
Miles Davis had a very complicated love life, if I remember correctly.
He
I mean, we
did.
already talked about it the last episode with the French actress who he could not speak French, yet he still had a long-time affair with. And
yeah, and
yeah.
we didn't. And there was another woman. I don't have her name in front of me, but he was married prior, in between pretty much those two relationships. He was married to for a while, and they were kind of like the Beyonce and Jay-Z of the time. Actually, I think I might have mentioned that in the last podcast.
I think you
but
did. Yeah.
there was some abuse. There was a lot of abuse, actually. Miles, because Davis got into the drugs and didn't like her. I don't guess flirtations with other people that he interpreted as. So that didn't end up well for them. But anyway, So this album, In a Silent Way, contains 2 side-long tracks that Massaro pieced together from different takes during the recording session, which is actually just over 1 day. So it's about a 3 or 4 hour recording session on February 18th, 1969, and then the album was released later on July 30th of that year. I read that it has 3 elements of a sonata in this album for these songs, which are exposition, development, and recapitulation. And I'm not going to explain what those are because I don't know what it means when I read the definition.
I could talk to that a little bit, but all right, go ahead.
Well, there you go, John. You might have actually talked about that in the Dolphy, because you talked a lot about the details there. But anyway, so a couple of quotes on this, which I thought were interesting. In a rave review, Rolling Stone's Lester Bangs, who we talked about in a previous episode.
CTS, I think, close to Hall of Famer Lester
He's getting
Bangs.
there. He is getting there. So he described the album as, it's the kind of album that gives you faith in the future of music. It is not rock and roll, but it's nothing stereotyped as jazz either. All at once, it owes almost as much to the techniques developed by rock improvisers in the last 4 years as to Davis's jazz background. It is part of a transcendental new music which flushes categories away, and while using musical devices from all styles and cultures, it is defined mainly by its deep emotion and unaffected originality. And another description of this album I saw that I thought was apropos was that it's dark, smoky, and ashen. So,
I would agree.
Two tracks, about 40 minutes total of music. Very different, fusion jazz. What did we think here? Josh, we'll start with you.
Oh, man. I'm glad you gave background. I should have looked up some of this stuff, honestly, because the jazz fusion and bringing in the elements of funk to this album, these tracks, I felt that listening to this. It is hard to break down 18-minute songs or try and grab things out of it, but it does kind of start a little slowly. It's got a real
as sonatas do in the introduction. So let me do some education here as we go. Go ahead.
Yes,
continue.
Good. So there and it's hard to. This album doesn't. So what am I trying to say? His horns don't come in right away, right?
Nope.
And it's very much like the organ, or I guess the electric piano, as you said. You get the drums and the bass, and then 4 minutes in, or however many minutes in, then the horns come in. And it seems like the horns come in and out, and it doesn't seem like he's necessarily the centerpiece of this album, right? It's not like horns all the time. It's very much like he's just part of the ensemble, which is different from some of the, well, especially from some of the Coltrane stuff that we've listened to, right? And so, and that takes place over both tracks. It's like that in the second track, it starts slow again, and then 4 minutes in, it switches to a lot more upbeat, and he comes in more, and then there's kind of this repeating pattern that I picked up on in both tracks that we've talked about in other jazz albums. So, and this is comparing this album to Sketches of Spain, which, as you said, is very different. Mm-hmm. It's much more, I guess I would say, melodic and vibey. I get the bass and the piano really kind of got that trance feel, like we did with Pharoah Sanders or something, in a way. Mm-hmm. So, that being said, with all my rambling, I did enjoy this album, but it's going to take me a few more listens to pick out more things and to get a feel for what he was trying to go for.
Okay, John.
So your buddy John did do his homework on this album, because I listened to it, I really liked it, and I wanted to kind of understand a little bit more thematically about what was going on. Mm-hmm. So once I understood what a sonata was and dug into it a little bit, I was able to pretty quickly identify when in listening to other music that was also sonatas, it has a feel, and so I won't go long on this, but basically a sonata is it starts with an introduction which is slow and focuses on the dominant key of the piece, okay? And that is definitely the case
And that's
in both of
exactly what
these
I
tracks
said.
if you listen. Exactly what you said, right? And that's why I was laughing when you said it. I was like, it could be called the introduction of a sonata. So, yep, so that's exactly what it is. Miles Davis is very restrained and not coming in with his instrumentation. It then moves, a sonata goes into the exposition at that point, and the exposition's probably the most important part of a sonata, but it expands out in different movements and thematic ideas. So the keys expand, different sounds come in, cadences change to create sort of the beginning of what's the movement in the piece, okay? And that is when you think of these pieces, right? That is where Miles Davis starts to come in, the more complex musicianship comes in terms of this. The development then comes in, and what happens there is that there's a rapid fire through the sounds that have been introduced in the exposition. So different keys, changing of tempos, and sometimes it'll even be held up and juxtaposed against the exposition. In the second piece, In a Silent Way, you'll hear that quite a bit in the middle of the track. Then there's a piece called The Recapitulation, and the recapitulation is when you begin to transition out of that middle frantic area and you start to get a little bit more major minor chord variation. And then it ends, not always, but sometimes with what's called a coda. And one of the tracks here does have a coda and one does not. And the codas sort of are like the conclusion, if you think of it as like a piece of writing, is the conclusion of it. And a coda is basically designed to repeat the development and recapitulation sections, but sort of tie them up. So to call back to them and bring it back. So I know that's a lot of like abstract idea, but that's kind of what you're looking at. The best way I can describe it is it's almost like how you're told to write a 5-paragraph essay, and then if you think of introduction, exposition, development, recapitulation, and coda, with the coda being the conclusion paragraph, and then the introduction being the intro paragraph or the thesis paragraph, the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation are the body, right? With the middle and the fourth adding more support and details. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Is
That
the coda in the second song, second track, or
the coda is in the second track? Yes.
Okay, so I felt that.
Yep. So I mean, I think Josh, you were getting it. You know what I mean in terms of how that he was structuring it, and because it's fusion, but it's not like the free jazz that we're used to, where it's kind of going over and breaking conventions, because there is a little bit of a structure to it. Because when we think of sonatas, right, what type of music do we think of most often? Classical, right? Mm-hmm. Music is where you hear in a lot of sonatas. So in understanding that and then listening to these albums, it really gives you an appreciation for what Miles Davis is doing, because as you guys mentioned, there's a vibe and a feel to this that isn't quite rock, but it certainly isn't like jazz that we've listened to before. Like, you can put this on and not quite identify it truly as jazz. Mm-hmm. It's a different type of music. And I'm familiar with Bitches Brew, which I believe is his next album after this, right? Which is often kind of called like jazz is rock music. And you can kind of see where he's going there. But I'm always amazed at the fact that a guy as talented as Miles Davis can lay back and not play as long as he does, and allows you to just, but then when he comes in, he doesn't overwhelm you either. He comes in as a part of layered musicianship, but you immediately recognize him, but not in a way that overwhelms the piece. Almost like a guitar solo, kind of like an extended guitar solo, but not like on an island like you imagine guitar solos being like in rock. More like if you threw this great guitar solo in as a whole bunch of other interesting stuff is happening around it. So
yeah, he's almost like a conductor on this album in a way.
That's what it feels like. It feels like a classical piece of music, but it doesn't sound classical. And I think that comes from that sonata structure. And so that was the only reason I really wanted to call back to that a little bit, because it's very difficult once you understand what the sonata format of music is to not hear these two pieces of music as two distinct sonatas. And I think I think before you listen to this, getting an understanding or listening to to other pieces of music that are similar to get a feel for it really helps you to understand what he's going for, because then you can take whatever you feel from the music and you can give it, it almost becomes like a story that you create on your own. And you know that, and that's the cool thing, because Sketches of Spain, we all sort of identified like a story that we were hearing, you know, of Spain and what we imagined Spain would be like. But this doesn't tie into anything specifically at all. It's a mood, and then you put yourself in the place that confers that mood to you. So very elemental jazz, very atmospheric jazz, but not like boring fade into the back atmospheric jazz. It's still full front and center. So I really like this quite a bit. It's probably my favorite jazz album that we've done so far.
Matt, what did you read anything about why this album is considered influential to other musicians, or
Well, I think it's nothing specific. I think part of it has to do with a couple. I mean, Davis was still a pretty big star, right, in the jazz world. I mean, Kinda Blue was and still is considered that the greatest jazz album of all time. I mean, so he and he was, he had that fame and he had that identity. I was kind of talking about the Jay-Z and Beyonce, so of that time. And so he in and of himself was was influential. And then when he hitches his wagon to this fusion music, right, and he starts hanging out with Jimi Hendrix and stuff, he was just a very well-respected musician across the board. And then he starts doing this, really he didn't invent fusion, but he was the one that just brought it to the forefront, and he did it very well. And and it was just a groundbreaking type of music that he was doing. And it's one of the things that, I've actually known this album. I've had this album for years. I got it when I was in that class that I was in college, the jazz class, because the description of Davis, I mean, he was, to me, the most interesting figure in pushing jazz forward into the rock and to the electronic areas, which really intrigued me. And so I did get this album, and I've always liked it. Like you guys are saying, it's got that. It's a very atmospheric type of record. It's very chill. I love the production on this. I love the organ and the piano, the keys in particular. I really like. It's just I don't know what exactly they're doing with the production of the sounds, but it's a great sound for those electronic pianos. It's not cheesy or gimmicky or anything like it. It's just a cool, relaxing type of sound. This is not a harsh record. I think that there's times where Davis's trumpet playing, when it does come in, because you're right, Josh, it does. It takes a while, and then even when he comes in, he takes it back, and then you don't hear him play again for another 6 or 7 minutes or whatever. Right? This is more of a keyboard album than it is a trumpet album.
Yeah.
And you could even say that with drums, because drums, bass, and keys are pretty much playing throughout this, and then Davis kind of comes and goes. Right? But you're right. When he's not playing, there's direction, because he's the band leader. But when he does play, that's what Davis was for the most part. He was kind of a subdued, more of a subtle type of musician who was known for as much as for what he wasn't doing as opposed to what he was doing, because he held back and did those things that contributed to the overall sound of the music. But no, this is a great album for me. It's a very unique album. It's an easier listen. When we get to, because we are going to cover Bitches Brew, and when we're in the 70s, and it's a very interesting way to juxtapose this album against that, because even though they are both fusion and electronic, it's very different. Like, he just takes it into even a more different direction, and it's a harsher listen, and we'll certainly get to that. But there was another quote that I came across that I thought was really interesting. A writer named Nick Southall from Stylus magazine called the album timeless, and he said that the fresh modes of constructing music that it presented revolutionized the jazz community, and the shifting ethereal beauty of the actual music contained within has remained beautiful and wonderful. Its echoes heard through the last 30 years, touching dance music, electronica, rock, pop, and all music. And it's it's really hard to describe what this is because it's really its own thing. I just think it's cool. It's just it's Miles Davis, and whether he's playing or not, I think that what the vibe that they were going for is a very interesting one, and it's a very easy one to listen to for jazz, right? Especially when you compare it to something like an Eric Dolphy or a Pharoah Sanders, which is a little bit more of that avant-garde stuff, and even Coltrane, because it's just a chill. It's not frantic or crazy. Coltrane goes kind of nuts sometimes, and it's great, but this is not that. It's a very unique record.
Yeah, he's very restrained. I don't know if restrained, but laid back, no, definitely.
Restraint's a good word. No, I think that's right. Holding back.
Yeah, every jazz album we listen to seems to be, the puzzle pieces are starting to come together a little bit in terms of being able to see different things that the artists are doing, and the progression. Like when John gave us kind of the history of the different types of jazz at the beginning. I can't remember what episode that was, but you can see how this is different from Eric Dolphy and Pharoah Sanders, and you can see how this is different than John Coltrane, and so I really appreciate that, being able to notice that difference musically.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to be doing too much more. I mean, I think we've got another Coltrane record coming up. We'll do Miles Davis again in the 70s. Oh, we have Charles Mingus, right? I haven't done him yet, but yeah, once we hit the 70s, I think that's where the rock explosion really comes in. So so we're not going to do too much more, but but this is Davis was I think part of this too was like he started seeing, like we talked about rock being the dominant most popular music at the time in the mid-late 60s. And Davis kind of saw these concerts and stuff that Hendrix and all these other rock artists were putting on, and he's like, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. So yeah. I think Davis was he was certainly he was motivated by creativity and trying to be original, but I think he was also motivated by money and popularity as well. So I don't think that make no mistake, he was definitely trying to sell records and be in the scene. So that was big part of it as well.
Interesting.
Well, and he was able to transition. I give him a lot of credit for that, because not everyone can just sort of change up their style just because they want to, and become
right.
Pop, have pop sensibility. So
yeah, well, or be able to change it up and be good, right? Or be influential, or just take it in a different direction. You can change stuff up, but unless you have the stuff behind it, that's not going to do any good. But he certainly did. Yeah.